Thank you all for joining us. My name is Lania, and I am the director of the UC A&R Fire Network. And we've been hosting these fire breaks for the last few months and plan to continue to do this really as a chance for folks within A&R and our close colleagues to get to know each other, to learn about different issues, to learn about each other's work, and to focus on topics that are kind of, of interest and relevant to your programs. So I know we have today some people who are outside of A&R, and we're super happy to have you here with us. And today's topic is really all around fire insurance. I know folks have probably been seeing a lot of coverage in the media over the last few months, and of course over the last couple of years, and just the landscape around fire insurance in California has been so dynamic, and a lot of controversy, a lot of challenges, some kind of bleak predictions for the future. So today we wanted to bring folks together to really try to understand this issue and to be able to ask questions. We did have a minor change, or not a minor change, a big change on the agenda, because Michael Wera, who was planning to join us from Stanford, ended up not being able to make today. He ended up having a family conflict. And so Yana Valachovic, our forest advisor and county director here in Humboldt County, agreed to jump in and fill in for him. And I'm super grateful. She's been following this work really closely and has a lot of good insight. So our first speaker today is Deborah Halberstadt. And Deborah is a senior climate policy advisor with the California Department of Insurance. I've worked quite a bit with Deborah over the years on prescribed fire-related policy and insurance issues, but she works on a lot of different things, especially related to climate change, and she'll be giving us an overview of some of the things that have been going on, including some major breakthroughs that happened at the end of last week. Then we'll go to Yana, who will muse a bit on what some solutions might be, just what some of the intricacies are around this, and also helping us as A&R advisors and specialists and partners think about how we can answer questions around these issues. So Yana will go, and then we'll have a pretty good chunk of time for questions and answers. So hold your questions until after both Deborah and Yana are done speaking, and then we can jump into the Q&A. So with that, Deborah, I'd love to open it up to you to share your screen and share your wisdom with us.
Thanks, Lanya. Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here and to see all of you. And there are some faces I recognize and some that I look forward to meeting in the future. Again, my name is Deborah. I'm the Senior Climate Policy Advisor with the California Department of Insurance. And as Lanya mentioned, we had a pretty significant set of announcements that Commissioner Lara made on Thursday. So I'm going to just walk through what we're doing right now in response to the wildfire insurance situation in California. And it's been, I'm sure, top of mind for many of you. But so last week, Insurance Commissioner Lara announced this package of executive actions that are aimed at addressing the current market situation in the California fire insurance market here. So these steps that he's announced are really designed to work together as an overall strategy. And the goal is for them to improve insurance choices and to protect Californians from increasing climate threats, while at the same time addressing the long-term sustainability of the nation's largest insurance market. And we're really trying to modernize the insurance market through three interlocking goals. Number one, to make insurance more available to Californians. Number two, to create a more resilient insurance market. And number three, to protect communities from climate change. And this strategy, this package, represents the largest insurance reform since voters passed Proposition 103 nearly 35 years ago. And it really builds on Commissioner Lara's multi-year effort and what we've been doing at the Department of Insurance over the past several years to modernize the California insurance market. We're trying to address a suite of problems that have compounded to significantly decrease access to wildfire insurance. And these factors include climate change, inflation, and increased costs of rebuilding are some of the primary ones. And so challenges led several insurance companies over the past year or so to pause coverage for new homeowners and for new commercial insurance policies, or to non-renew existing customers, or to increase rates to maintain their financial stability. So unlike public utilities, which are required by law to cover all consumers, insurance companies are not required and will not write insurance, especially in high-risk areas, unless they're able to ensure that they have the capital and the reserves to meet all the insurance claims submitted by consumers, to cover their expenses and to earn a profit. So they've really been reducing their coverage over the last year. And as they reduce coverage, many people were pushed into the FAIR plan. So the FAIR plan is intended as California's insurer of last resort. It has doubled to 3% of the market, and it has really become the insurer of first resort for many Californians, which is not how it was designed to be. And so this growing FAIR plan is a problem because FAIR plan policyholders are required to pay more for less coverage. Additionally, in concentrating the highest risk properties within the FAIR plan increases the chance that the plan itself won't be able to afford a catastrophic disaster. So it's really become clear that California's current insurance framework needs help. It just is not meeting our current needs. So Insurance Commissioner Lara recognized that we need updated regulations focused on current market conditions, so that we can more effectively protect consumers. We want a modern, sustainable market that incentivizes safety and that reduces risk. So this new type of market wouldn't retreat from high-risk areas, but would instead utilize a long-term strategy to continue providing coverage to consumers. There are several key executive actions and reforms of the plan. I'm not going to walk through all of them because there's actually quite a number, but just as kind of the highlights, first, we want to increase the availability of insurance in wildfire distressed areas. So we want to transition homeowners and businesses from the FAIR plan back into the normal insurance market with commitments from insurance companies to cover all parts of California by writing no less than 85% of their statewide market share in high wildfire risk communities. Second, we want to return FAIR plan policyholders back from the FAIR plan to traditional insurance, with first priority given to homes and businesses that comply with our Safer from Wildfire regulation that we adopted last year. So this is beneficial because it not only transitions people off of the FAIR plan, but it also enhances the state's overall wildfire safety efforts. Number three, we want to expedite the department's introduction of regulations to use forward-looking catastrophe models to prioritize wildfire safety, mitigation, and transparency. So we are currently holding workshops and meeting with stakeholders on catastrophe modeling in order to draft regulations that allow for long-term sustainability of coverage and rates. That was, I think, number three. And I think number four is that we're going to explore the use of allowing insurers to use to recoup California-only reinsurance costs. So reinsurance is a tool that many insurance companies use to manage their own climate risk and to be able to continue writing policies. So here we're talking about allowing them to use that for the costs associated for reinsurance for California-specific events. We're not talking about like typhoons in Thailand, but we're talking about California events here. As far as the FAIR plan, the department is going to continue to modernize the FAIR plan by expanding commercial coverage limits to $20 million per structure. And the goal here is really to close coverage gaps for homeowners associations and for affordable housing, infill developments, and agribusiness, all of these larger institutions that have had trouble finding coverage. We also want to protect the FAIR Plan's long-term solvency by implementing proposals to increase financial stability, improve governance, planning, and claims handling of consumer complaints. So to enable those actions, we're planning to improve rate filing procedures and timelines within the department, hire additional department staff to review rate applications and inform regulatory changes, and enact intervenor reform that should increase transparency and public participation in the process. So at the end of the day, California's this new sustainable insurance strategy builds on actions we've taken over the last several years, including enacting regulations to support and encourage home hardening, budget requests to support wildfire risk reduction, legislation to improve insurance benefits, and others. And we see this strategy as really a critical piece of creating safer communities, as well as, and simultaneously, a sustainable insurance marketplace in the face of our accelerating climate and financial risks. So that, Lenya, is sort of where we are right now with the new proposal, and I can turn it over to Lenya to talk a little bit about what she's got going on.
Great. Well, thanks, Deborah. That was really helpful. And I think Yana will go ahead and share, and I think Yana has some slides. And so let's go ahead and go to Yana and hear from her, and then we'll bring it back. I'm sure people have questions for you, and but we can do that kind of as a group discussion at the end, if that sounds good.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon. Yep. Thanks, Deborah, for that lead off. And I may be a little clunky. I was having some Zoom problems and got in just a couple minutes late, so I didn't hear the kickoff there. But I just want to say hello to all of the colleagues that are out there. And I know you're all hearing chatter about stuff going on in the insurance space. You're probably running into family and neighbors that are saying, what the heck is going on? How do we work through these issues? And so I was asked to fill in for Michael at the last second, and so I'll see what I can do to sort of give some context for some of these bigger challenging issues. So is my screen at the right scale? I can't see it. It's a little funny to me. Am I right now?
Yana, we are seeing.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. There it is.
That's what I thought. So, and I just want to acknowledge, like, Max is in the room. Steve Quarles is in our room here. We've got some folks that also spend a fair bit of time in this space, and so I look forward to a rich conversation among all of you. And I just want to say a couple little things, right? If you weren't paying attention, we've lost over 43,000 structures in the last 10 years. That has an impact in our financial markets and our insurance markets in a way that I think we all were hoping wouldn't occur. But, it's not in a vacuum. We know that the insurance world is monitoring and evaluating this. And so Deborah threw out the concept of reinsurance. And did you define reinsurance, Deborah?
Maybe very briefly.
Okay, so we know we have admitted carriers in California. Those are like the big name brands like Farmers and State Farm. And if you're an insurance company, you also want some insurance on your investments. And so there's this whole group of other insurers, which are called reinsurers. And so you're seeing premium prices increases in California through our regular insurance companies. But additionally, it's the premium prices are also increasing through the reinsurance market. And if I have this correct, and Steve, maybe you can type in the chat if I get this wrong. My understanding is that most of the reinsurers are not US-based companies. They are from other arenas. And so they become a little difficult for us to reach in from a policy perspective because they operate or are bigger than the state of California. So we've got, an environment where we've got the Department of Insurance, which is, tasked as a consumer watchdog organization and an organization that in state government can, set rates, manage rates, think about affordability. but they also think about availability. And, we're in this dynamic market now with, so many losses, and then everyone's sort of passing the buck onto someone else. And we as consumers are kind of caught in the middle trying to figure out how to maintain insurance for our homes. So, when you think about wildfire and wildfire protection strategies, there are a lot of dials in this space, and we heard just the concept about defensible space. We could talk about building codes. We can also talk about the land use space around where to build, how do we get ingress and egress and evacuate people quickly, how do we build the right fire response team that's in a position to deploy as rapidly as we need, and how do we manage the wildland so that it's in the best condition to be able to be robust to wildfire exposure and be resilient to wildfire exposure. But a really important component, I think, in our overall mitigation and protection space is insurance. You will see a quote that I give a little bit later, but I'm going to borrow a quote from Michael Wara, who we were hoping would speak today. But he makes the statement that wildfire insurance is really a great climate risk mitigation. It's one of the ways that we try to assure, and be able to protect our wealth that we have accumulated in our homes and properties. So they're a really important partner, private sector, and we've got, public sector needs. So how do we design and manage that system best to be able to work functionally in a dynamic and changing world? The good news for California so far this year is that we haven't had a major wildfire loss. We're coming into the season where that often occurs, into the early fall. And so, I'm hopeful that this year we'll be able to kind of ride it out. I think that'll send some positive market signals. But at the same time, issues like what happened in Hawaii and Maui, I think really also send shockwaves in that framing where I think most of us think of Hawaii as a lush and tropical place. How could a wildfire of this condition happen? So, how our reinsurance markets, how our regular admitted carriers think about these broader issues, and whether they're framing it specifically from California or all Western states or including Hawaii. There's just a lot of pressure that's coming to force some reconsiderations. So what you have been hearing, and we knew there were some negotiations that were happening among the governor and the legislature and the Department of Insurance in trying to address these issues. There's been a number of things that have been on the table, and those have included like a way to sort of pass through reinsurance rate increases to the consumer. And I think we can all have opinions about whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but that's one of the cards that have been on the table. There's also this issue of the FAIR plan, which is California's insurance plan of last resort. It really came about in the 1960s after the LA riots, and an urban context where people were trying to protect those business owners and these urban environments that have been subject to something that people couldn't anticipate. And so that's where the FAIR plan got its origin. It is now, much more in our it's much more commonly used in our rural areas and even some of our, quasi-suburban areas. So the FAIR plan, has a hook to it, and it requires that insurers in California, pay into that plan. And I think about it from like a healthcare perspective. We in essence are putting our folks that are most at risk or are most maybe unhealthy into a plan. And then we're hoping that we've shored it up financially well enough to be able to, be robust against, a potential loss. It's like putting all the sick people in one pool and not being able to spread out the risk amongst a population of both healthy and sick people. So it inherently is a challenging task to make the FAIR plan work for all of us. Thank goodness that we have it as an option. But it is something to consider in terms of how we've structured that market. The other request that's been on the table is the ability to use CAT models or categorical models, which are forecasting tools that are be able to sort of look forward, use other variables to project what future rates should be. And we've been limited in the ability to do that based on a proposition called Proposition 103, which was designed to create the Department of Insurance, give that department the ability to manage and control rate increases for a consumer protection perspective. But it also dictated that rates should be based on past performance and shouldn't use kind of future predictions. So we've been stuck a little bit in trying to think about how you might manage and think about climate changes and other hazards changing to be able to set rates. So that's been one of the other requests that's been on the table. And so what you just heard today, which is very exciting news, is that on Thursday of last week, the governor issued an executive order granting the insurance commissioner and that department the ability to promulgate emergency regulations. And so what that does is it gives kind of a 6-month cover, if we want to call it, for the Department of Insurance to set up an emergency framework to work through basically the hard details of permanent regulations. And so I think there's some great elements that are involved in that conversation. What I thought I would, leave with you all today is sort of the broader, bigger picture context issues. So, how much did Maui affect California as one point of consideration? Will we see another big loss? I hope we don't. But what will that do for kind of the temperature and the climate issues around how we think about these broader challenges? Will the insurance companies feel less interested in trying to stay in California? And then at the same time, reinsurance rates are likely to reset in January. Last year, they went up 25 to 40%. And so that affects all insurers. So will we see that continued trajectory? I don't really have the answer to those questions. Some of the other bigger questions are, where are the non-renewals occurring? We don't have a good understanding mapping, a mapping ability to be able to really look at who's insured, where the non-renewals are occurring broadly. I've seen one county basically tried to corral some of that data. And, I think we have some speculation that it's in our higher risk hazard ratings that are being mapped by the state. But it's a bit haphazard, and I think it would be useful to know where exactly we see the greatest risk occurring. There's an additional question of how many are going without insurance. One of the statistics I've heard is that 30 to 40% of homeowners do not have a mortgage. So who are they and where do they live? And, I think it's not unreasonable to speculate there probably are older populations in particular who have accumulated enough wealth to pay off their mortgages. But those folks tend to be, very financially limited and of course, quite vulnerable. So there's some broader socioeconomic questions that we need to think about. And I think, another specific idea to recognize is that there's risk across all of California. And so, it's not limited to these little corners of California. It's really broadly spread. And, what we don't know is, when the next ignition of significance will occur and kind of what the sequence is that will lead towards, potential loss. So, how do we as extension staff, how do we address these issues? How do we think about them? And, what I'd like to share is that I think a lot of people are in denial about their own risks. And I think it's important for us to be able to be somewhat fluent in the conversation and talk to folks about how they can mitigate their risks. And so we heard Deborah talk about defensible space and home hardening actions. Those are all really critical steps. There's also, FireWise community coordinations and designations. And what you'll see now through the Department of Insurance's strategy to help manage price and create discount is really, a way to get some credit for those types of actions. What I want to say is I think it's really important to encourage documentation of those mitigations, to be able to market your property, whether it's to a real estate agent, should you choose to sell it, or whether it's to an insurer of the future. Because being able to express coherently about how you are as a homeowner in protecting the exterior envelope of the building, as well as reducing the fuels across the property, is really important. And to me, they're almost as important these days when you go to the buying and selling of a home as marketing a remodeled kitchen and a new bathroom, because these are key elements that suggest and send to the future buyer that you're serious about these issues and that you've handled them well. The state has also done some things. There was Assembly Bill 38, and I can't remember what year that was, maybe 2019. And it required a disclosure process, and one of the two steps has kicked in. So now when a property is in the state responsibility area and it's of a wildfire hazard rating of moderate or higher, no, I think it's just high. There is a requirement that there's an inspection of the defensible space around the property, and that is typically done now through CAL FIRE. So it's an affirmation, and it is a communication to the future homeowner that these are the defensible space actions that have taken place. What kicks in next year is a further disclosure of the home hardening actions that have taken on the property. So these two items together will help, communicate, the status of the home. That's done through other parties. But I would just encourage us all to be working with our friends and neighbors and clients to be able to say, like, the more that we document that stuff, I think it'll be really relevant as we try and communicate to whomever, whether it be the insurer of the future, the insurer you have today, or someone that you might be trying to sell your property to, kind of what you've done to set that property up for success. I'll just leave, I think, with one last slide here. So if you don't know what the FAIR plan is, the FAIR plan is basically a pathway to get fire insurance. And so to get comprehensive coverage, which is what it takes to be able to maintain a mortgage, you need now, if you had a non-renewal, basically the FAIR plan plus what's called a DIC, or difference in conditions policy, that covers liability, theft, and water. So it's a two-plan approach to be able to get comprehensive coverage. So there's a lot of competition, a lot of plan options in the difference in condition world, but the FAIR plan is the place where you go when you can't get fire insurance. When I live in Arcata, and I still have insurance, and what I have for comprehensive coverage covers both of those two elements, covers fire, liability, theft, water, all into one plan. So if that's, I thought I'd help detangle some of that. With that, I will say that I appreciate the chance to be here, and I've got we can talk about all kinds of different things, and talk about catastrophe models, or talk about whatever's on your mind. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Yana. That was such a clear and helpful description of some of the things that are going on. And we did start getting some questions in the chat. So we have about a half an hour to really dive in and have a good conversation about this. So, and I have a couple questions too, but I'll hold off. Let's see. Let's go first, I guess, to Laura's question. Is the insurance situation in California due to wildfire being experienced in other states with other types of events like hurricanes? I don't know which one. Maybe Deborah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with climate change, we're going to be seeing accelerating climate impacts around the world. And we are certainly seeing that in other states. So, I mean, if you think back to 2020, I remember this quite vividly. There were fires all throughout the Pacific Northwest and California. And if you wanted to leave California to escape the fire, you actually couldn't. There was like no direction to go because we were surrounded, Oregon and Nevada, and then the smoke was drifting into Utah, and then Utah caught fire. And so it was, I think that this is going to be problematic as we continue to unless we take climate mitigation steps, drastic steps immediately, we're going to see all of these kinds of events increasing. And you mentioned hurricane. So, I mean, usually California doesn't have to worry about hurricane, but of course we had one in Los Angeles earlier this year. So the simple answer is yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, and people can unmute and actually ask their questions live. So Jim, I see you have your hand up.
Can I add on a
Or
little
did you
bit?
want to add on to that?
Yeah, I do want to add on to it because I think it's interesting. You know, not every state manages insurance in the same way that we do in California, and I'm less familiar with what goes on across California, across the United States, but there's a lot of lessons that we can take from other locations, and Florida is, I think, a particularly important one for us to keep an eye on, because you know there's this debate between affordability and availability, and as much as it sounds cold and heartless, if we don't have availability, then all hell breaks loose basically for our state. If we can't get insurance, if we can't get insurance, we basically have no ability to be able to, realize the wealth we have accumulated in our properties. Because if you can't find a buyer and the buyer, needs a mortgage, the mortgage is going to require to be backed by insurance. And so in Florida, it got to a really sticky place related to hurricanes, and they have been going through a lot. They've lost a lot of their big carriers, and they moved to more regional carriers. And there's a lot that could be said around how they've navigated through those challenges. So when you add it up and you look at homeowners insurance costs, I got a handle on some data recently, and it compared all the states. So I was curious, is California the most expensive state or not? Right? We complain about it a lot, and so we know we've got hurricanes, we know we've got tornadoes, we know we have flooding areas, and what I saw was that California was about 12th or 13th on the list, somewhere in there, and that there were many other states where insurance was more expensive, and that included Washington and Oregon. That could be based on how regulation occurs within those states. But I think, there's also kind of the harsh reality that Oregon and Washington have been going through with the kind of wildfire losses that I think, people wanted to pretend could not happen there. So I think we're all into this, all the states are really in this in the same way with equal challenges, natural disaster challenges pushing down on us. And I think the question that we have is, what was within our control and what is it that we can manage to try and mitigate some of those issues and become, someone that you would like to be, that someone that could be insured. I mean, in the same way that like life insurance, right? You don't get life insurance unless you're healthy, right? It's pretty hard to get a life insurance policy. So you communicate to, through your medical records that you're healthy. I think the homeowner's insurance piece is kind of the same way. You need to communicate that my property is in good shape and that I am, going to be robust to those kinds of exposures.
Great. Cool. Well, thanks, Yana. Thanks for that added info. Jim, I'd like to go to you, but if folks could introduce themselves and kind of like where they're coming from, because we don't know some of you and you're not in our A&R circle necessarily, but we'd love to hear who you are. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question live.
Sure. I'm in Marin County in Master Gardeners, but also heavily involved with a lot of the activity. Specifically, I'm on what's called the Fire Smart Landscaping team in Master Gardeners for Marin. So a lot of what we do is present information for the residents about what they can do for defensible space, but also get involved with side questions like insurance, because people ask about that. My question, and it's maybe a combination of Yana and Deborah. The challenge, what's been announced by some of the insurance companies, and it's tied in with the Safer from Wildfire initiative, is that if you implement all of a set of actions, which include both defensible space and home hardening, then you get 5, 10, 15% discount. So you end up with property owners dealing with a significant expense to implement those changes versus deciding what happens with insurance. I guess my question is there any attempt to try to, and Yana sort of touched on this, have a scale that says if you do these 3 things, you get some amount. If you do 5 more, you do some amount. And I realize that fire is really all or nothing in many cases, right? So you do have to implement almost everything. And what's being done, and maybe whether from a state point of view, not necessarily insurance, if there's any look at helping homeowners implement some of those changes.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So I think that you raised some really important questions, and these are issues that we have tried to address. I mean, it continues to evolve, but the department adopted regulation last year called Safer from Wildfire, which does provide that does require insurance companies to look at the types of home hardening steps you've taken and adjust the premium accordingly. So we don't lay out like you must, give a 15% discount for a roof, Class A roof, but it does require insurance companies to acknowledge and adjust the premium based on the types of steps you've taken. And then there's also in AB 38 that Yana laid out in her talk, there is a different section of that law that is a grant program for low and moderate income households that says, if you can't afford to make these kinds of improvements to your home because we recognize that they're expensive, there should be money from the state to cover some of those costs. So it sort of depends each year how much the legislature and the governor appropriate for that program, and I think it probably could stand to be expanded, but at least the mechanism is there to provide support for those folks to be able to improve their homes. The one other thing I wanted to mention in light of you being a master gardener is I think that there's a lot of potential for thinking through how the landscaping aspect of fire protection could be improved. And we've talked to the green building folks about like, well, could we do some sort of training for landscapers or for the maintenance, landscape maintenance people to make sure that you have the 5 feet of defensible space around your home, or that you're planting plants that are not going to burn as easily. How can we start rethinking not just the building, the structure itself, but the surrounding area to keep it beautiful, but also more fire safe. So I think that there's a lot of room there for further conversation.
If I may, and Deborah, correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding, so the insurance commissioner last year did rulemaking for what this program is called Safer from Wildfires, and it has 3 different bins. One's about the defensible space, one's about the home hardening, and one's about kind of the community preparedness and the community context. And so he or the department put out the option for insurers to basically say how they might address those types of mitigations, and then what might be reasonable discounts that can be associated with those. And so in the rate filing process that is just coming to a close, insurers are basically disclosing what kinds of discounts might be possible. So Jim, back to your question about you don't have to have everything, but you could have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and those together might add up to 7% discount or something to that effect. And I think the first approved one just was released last month, which was the discounts that are associated with a FAIR plan. So the FAIR plan used to just have discounts for being part of FireWise, but now it's got discounts for some other elements of the defensible space and home hardening. So if I'm not out of step, Deborah, what I was going to say is that I think we're about to see the other discounts start to roll as each of those rates go through the approval process at the Department of Insurance. So is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then when it comes to AB 38, and Steve Quarles just noted this, so it was written as a pilot program to try and use FEMA money and state money for helping uplift communities that could use some work in that space. And there are 3 initial pilot communities that are being tested, and they just added 3 more. And I saw a nice press release last week about kind of the stage they're at with those different programs. I know there's been a lot of legal challenges to try and work through, and logistical challenges, because FEMA then has NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, kind of overlaying and intersecting into some of these activities. And that's been a little bit more challenging than some folks anticipated. But I think we're going to start to see these types of programs roll, at least in a couple of communities at scale. And so it'll be neat to see how those can play out.
Great. Let's go to Melissa's question in the chat. So she says, I'm totally new to this topic, so not sure if it's a naive question, but would it be useful for more people to use the FAIR plan who are not in as high risk of locations to spread the risk around more?
I mean, I guess theoretically, but you wouldn't want to pay that level of cost. I mean, right now I pay for my homeowner's policy something like $1,600, and I hear people with fair plan costs at like 16,000. So voluntarily signing up for something like that might not be in your self-interest.
Deborah, did you want to say something about that?
No, I agree. I think that it's more expensive and the coverage is more limited. So, like Yana said, you wouldn't seek out the fair plan, but it is your insurer of last resort.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that. I guess I'm sort of picturing, yeah, I appreciate that sense of scale. Like if you were to just like right now go and try to, I know, I'm just going to go do that. That is a bit of a deterrent, but I mean, it just makes me wonder if like, is that a direction that could be gone in which you try to encourage more and more people to be on it to bring those costs down rather, or I mean, so I guess I'm trying to, if the large question is sort of about, you know, private sector is a huge part of this, but I mean, does the private sector have to be a huge part of this? Is there a solution that isn't that way? That's the kind of high level naive question about it. I'm sure there's a reason it's that way, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think from our perspective, the private market is superior. I think having competition and a robust market would be superior. I know that I mean, partially because so this is a complicated question. So the FAIR plan is not a state operated plan, right? The state doesn't fund it, which is different from other FAIR plans in other states. But in some place like Florida, where it is they have this citizens plan that is more state operated, more and more of the costs are being then borne by the citizens, by the taxpayers, and it's sort of becoming more of a social good than a private good. And I think that that creates complexity. And there are some concerns there that we would want to think through. In California, like I said, the FAIR plan is not a public plan, so it's kind of distinct. But you could have, I mean, it's conceivable that you could have one kind of ballooning entity that absorbs most of the risk and most of the plans, and you have less competition, but you have more certainty of being able to get it. I think that it would become increasingly expensive because you have more and more people in higher and higher risk homes that would sort of, even if you had a bunch of lower risk homes, like I'm not sure that it would pencil out very well for any of the members of that plan. So, I mean, I haven't done any sort of calculations on that, but I'm just making some assumptions here. I do think that, and then the kind of the process that we've taken at the department is actually to encourage people to leave the FAIR plan. Like, how can we get the admitted carriers to offer more coverage and remove people from the queue in the FAIR plan as opposed to pushing more onto the FAIR plan. So I think we've kind of gone the opposite direction in the announcement that we made Thursday. But I think, I think you raise an interesting philosophical question there and kind of a economic philosophy question.
Right. I mean, and the problem, of course, you're sort of raising the issue that if the risk, I mean, if just from climate change issues in general, if risk is increasing just like globally, we're just all, like how do you distribute risk when the risk is just high everywhere? Like it's kind of
right. It's really, I mean, I think that particularly with climate change, we're going to be seeing, I think, a shift in all of our systems, right? Like kind of the systems that underlie everything are going to evolve, and I think insurance as an industry is going to evolve, and I think that our relationship to it will. I just don't know at this moment. We're in sort of a transition, and it's a very painful one for a lot of people. So
thank you.
Melissa, I think you ask an interesting question though about like how do we pool our resources for the common good, and if we work together, is there something we can do? And I think that the science behind how homes are lost has gotten much more advanced, and I think we understand it pretty well. I think the public doesn't understand that yet. And there's a lot of stuff that we can do individually on our individual properties that make a big difference, but there's also a need to work together at scale. because the condition of your neighbor can be equally powerful on the exposure side as the work you've done. And so, you know, if we were to be better about kind of working for societal good, I think it would be about, you know, how do we lift our community? How do we lift our neighborhood together? And, you know, the old fashioned block parties, work parties. I mean, I keep talking to people about like event screen party. You could, you know, buy some snips and buy some different screen and be a great little community service project, whether it's for our 4-H clubs, whether it's for our service clubs, you know, and you could work from one house to the next and with, you know, a modest amount of skill, a staple gun and some finer mesh screen. So the 1/8 metal mesh, you know, yeah, you probably need some gloves, but because, you know, cutting wire mesh is not fun, but, you know, this is not technical, you know, super techie stuff. Like we can do a lot if we are able to really talk to each other and identify it. And of course, the best way to do is to start by leading by example. Well, it's not so good when you say, well, you ought to do, but you know, here's what I'm doing and here's how I'm managing it. It's a conversation.
One more thought, because I think I 100% agree with Yana, and I love the idea of a vent party. That's great. But one of the things that we did this year is we sponsored legislation that has been passed by the legislature on the governor's desk right now to create a series of pilot projects in the state, climate insurance pilot projects. And they're really focused on how do we create safer communities. So it's really looking at community-based insurance and like innovations in insurance that we can use to protect more people, you know, nature-based solutions, various types of approaches that people have been talking about a lot recently, and we want to push them forward in the state through pilot projects to test out the concepts and see how do they work, how can they be improved, what do we need to do to make them as effective as possible. And I think that this notion of risk reduction at the community level and then associated insurance availability and potential decreases in premium costs is really powerful. And so that's sort of the direction that we're looking at for flood and fire, and then introducing insurance for extreme heat.
Great. Van, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I haven't been following this closely for the last couple of years, but one thing that, you know, especially under Max has been sort of leading a lot of the thinking on this, but is the idea of sort of coupling fire management with sort of urban planning and the basic idea that we need to be, you know, really, we have a series of houses that are already built that are difficult for insurance reasons. We also have sort of a housing need, and we can build houses much more safely in other places. And I'm curious if on sort of the legislative side, if there's been any attempts to sort of combine these two, because it feels like there could be interesting solutions that are really only addressed by sort of thinking more broadly than just the houses that are already on the landscape.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And I think that, you know, the Department of Insurance has been working really closely with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And we actually have like a small working group to think about urban planning, land use development, and insurance and how they fit together. And sort of, again, going back to the risk reduction concept, how do you reduce the risk for the most people to make it safe to either, you know, there are places where we should build, and there are places where we really legitimately shouldn't be building, and we need to be thinking about that in terms of affordable housing. I mean, you do come into this conflict, right, of like you want to build as many houses as possible to how, you know, we have this housing shortage, but at the same time you don't want to put people in harm's way. How do you sort of overcome those barriers? And I think it requires thoughtful conversation with all of the experts at the table. And yeah, so I agree with you on that.
You know, Van, there's one bill to watch out for, because there's a lot of tension between meeting affordable housing and our housing stock needs in California. And so a lot of effort tries to try and accelerate accessory dwelling units and densification in general. And so the kind of the push-pull tension between, you know, what do we build new and where do we do that? And do we fill it into a neighborhood that is in a certain condition that maybe is a little out of date when it comes to the fire space? It's just I think some really rich opportunity for some of the work that you do and Max does to try and really think about what that means. But there was a bill specifically this year, which is designed to accelerate and make it easier to be able to do that building, which we need. I mean, we need places for people to live in California. There's no doubt about that. But it is in conflict with how we think about some of these fire issues and how we do analysis to get at those questions appropriately on that scale.
Let's go to Rex, and Rex, if you could introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Thanks. My name is Rex Frazier. I'm the president of the Personal Insurance Federation of California. So I'm not an academic. I'm the lawyer lobbyist for the large property insurance companies in California up in Sacramento. And I've worked with some of you and look forward to working with others. I guess my question / statement is, I think where insurers are most in need of academic support is on the issue of effective hazard reduction around structures that could lead to better insurance results. While, we fund, the insurance industry, among others, funds a major research arm, the insurance, IBHS, and they've made progress on fire structure, defensible space, home hardening issues, and have come up with a system of mitigation recommendations called Wildfire Prepared Home. I think the next step we need to take is to be able to give homeowners associations and cities and other leaders more guidance on what type of community scale projects will lead to increased insurance availability. Because people, they can do everything right and do home hardening and defensible space, but the current tools that insurers use could still rule those folks out as eligible for admitted market coverage because of the surrounding hazard. And we don't currently have the scientific knowledge, certainly not the vocabulary, to help communities do their mitigation efforts in a way that will lead to a better insurance result. We did a pilot project with a Southern California city, and we had an insurance scoring vendor do an overview of the city with a satellite showing where the insurance risk was, and then the fire chief showed us where he planned to do all of his mitigations, and there was virtually no overlap of what the chief thought was the areas that were in need of mitigation versus the areas that triggered high insurance risk scores. Mm-hmm. And so there's just a missing connection here where there's all this money being spent on mitigation, but it doesn't really in any way respond to the things that are triggering companies to decrease availability.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Rex, and thanks for being on today. Yana or Deborah, did you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I think it's a very astute comment, and I super appreciate that you're here and joining us today. One of the roles that Deborah and I and Max Moritz have is that we're all on the state's wildfire risk modeling committee, and we're about to see a report issued around how to think about risk modeling. And the conclusion really is a pretty small one, but it's that we need to figure out how to socialize and share data and have a better understanding of when you turn one dial, what does that do? And if you turn a different dial, what does that do? Because so much of this process has been through the private sector collecting data. It's not always public sector data. And so, people don't have a lot of access to information or know how it's interpreted. And so if anything good comes out of that committee, I hope it's that we have a more transparent, socialized conversation around what exactly we're trying to reduce and what risk and what mitigation pays off in what way. So I look forward to kind of seeing that next evolution, and I think it'll be out for public release quite soon. So maybe within a month.
Deborah, did you want to add anything there?
I think, yeah, I agree with Rex. I think that finding a way to to match what the technology is showing as far as risk and where the fire chiefs are seeing risk. Like understanding why there is a mismatch is critical, and then figuring out how to line them up better, and then take those steps to reduce risk. I mean, I think that sounds like an excellent academic endeavor, and I'd be fully supportive of it.
We've been, if I might add, we've been trying to convince the insurance industry vendors to look at potential customers as local governments, but they don't. Their customers are the insurance companies. They don't. And so it just seems to us that if we could have vendors that could go to local governments and help them in a way that syncs up with the way insurers are assessing the situation, that all it would take is one community to show that they've enacted or they've taken the actions that will reduce the scores that these vendor tools for insurers are producing. And if that was a viable path forward, I just have to think money would rain down from the sky for grant programs for local governments to be able to pay for these satellite surveys by these vendors and really start to hone in on what it takes for a community to reduce their hazard and ultimately to bring more homes into insurance eligibility.
Yeah, I think there's also an interesting question around how much people are willing to share about their properties in some kind of publicly collected data set. And if you think about social behavior, when you go to the doctor and they'll ask you, how much alcohol did you drink last week? And, how many what's your good food diet look like? All of us have an interesting tension around what do we share or not share, thinking about the consequence. And so I'm using that as an analogy to say, like, what are we really willing to share as homeowners around what our property conditions are and whether we've really done the true mitigations. I think we all kind of look for a little grade inflation, and because we're afraid it's going to come back and get us at some point. So I think if we clearly understood like the data and how it would be used and interpreted, I think people would be much more willing to say, yeah, I have dual pane windows. I have, modified those to tempered glass in these situations. I've, really clearly adopted 0 to 5. I've upgraded my vents, my trees are in this condition. Because some of those things we can see remotely, but some of those things we can't. And to know that it's not going to come back to bite you.
Yeah. You guys, I did want to note that we're at 1 o'clock, so I want to respect people's time, even though obviously this is a really interesting conversation. We could probably keep going with it. There were a few things in the chat that we didn't get to. So I'm sorry for that, but feel free to reach out to me, to Yana, to Katie, on the A&R side about these issues, or if you have other ideas for these fire breaks. Also, if you'd like to be added to our email list, please do email Katie. She put her email in the chat. So we will be posting the recording of this on our YouTube channel, which Katie also put in the chat. And we look forward to seeing some of you on the next one. Huge thanks to Deborah and to Yana for putting together such a really interesting conversation and sharing their wisdom with us.